evening, good afternoon, depending on where you're joining from today. Thank you for joining our weekly live podcast interview. This is a weekly podcast interview we do each week, every Tuesday, same time, same place. We talk about stuff related to digital transformation for the Transformation Ground Control podcast. You can learn more about the Transformation Ground Control podcast and see all of our episodes by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent consulting firm that helps clients through the world with their digital transformation initiatives. We help clients with their digital strategies, their software selection, as well as their implementations of different types of technologies. So our topic today that we're going to cover with our guest, who I'll introduce in just a moment, is data management and retention in digital transformation. So we're going to cover and dive into the data sides of things, which is an extremely relevant topic today, given that data is such an important asset for organizations. Cybersecurity is such an important consideration for organizations. And with the emergence of new technologies like artificial intelligence and machine learning and RPA and things of that nature, data is more important than ever. So we're going to talk about sort of the convergence of how those three dynamics sometimes not only emphasize or underscore the importance of data and companies' biggest assets, or one of the company's biggest assets, but also some of the risks and the trade-offs associated with data management and data retention. So we're gonna dive into that topic here today. And fear not, we're not just going to talk. We're not just going to talk about it. We're actually going to do a bit of a game show about halfway through. We'll cover some context setting to start, and then we'll get into more of a game show type of a format as we get through the conversation. And that's really a way to unpack and give some case studies and use cases of how you might consider and evaluate some of the different trade-offs with data management and data retention. So that's the context for today. I'm going to introduce our guest in just a moment, but before I do, I want to just point out that we are taking live audience questions as well. So whichever platform you're listening or watching on today, please feel free to drop in the chat any questions or comments you have along the way. In fact, we're going to ask you, the audience, questions as we go through the conversation. So please be prepared. We're going to put you on the spot. And also, if you don't mind, to get started, if you don't mind dropping in the chat what city and country you're joining from today. Just to get us started here, I'd love to see where our global digital transformation community is joining us from here today. And then the last thing I'll mention while you're dropping in the chat where you're joining from today, this conversation, this interview will actually become part of the Transformation Ground Control podcast that gets released a week from tomorrow. So every Wednesday we have new podcast episodes, and you can learn more about that or see all of our episodes by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com. So while you're dropping in the chat, what's city and country you're from as well, I'd love to introduce our guest, a guest who's been on before a couple times now, Chad Baker from LAE Software. So Chad, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. Thank you.
It's good to see you again. And you do a lot and have a lot of background in data management and data retention, which we're going to get to here in just a moment. But before we jump in, maybe just tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, and what LAE Software does.
Yeah, so I'm the founder of LAE Software. And what we do is we try to write software that is automated, really to make IT admins' jobs easier, because that's where we come from. So that's actually in the name. So a lot of people are curious what the LAE part of LAE Software is. It comes from actually Microsoft exams in the early 2000s. Kind of date myself, of course, but they would always start with the question would start and say, it would say, with least administrative effort. So LAE, what is the right way to answer this question? So really what it was saying is there's multiple ways to solve a problem, but what is the way that's going to be the most efficient? That kind of stuck with me, and that became kind of it's kind of our mission statement and company name, as we're trying to make things easier for admins.
Right. Yeah. And so you guys do development of all kinds of different types of software solutions. Is that right?
Correct. And we have one main product right now that it goes out and automatically finds Microsoft Outlook PST data, which is basically a mailbox and a file. So a lot of companies have been around for a long time, have a bunch of these out on their network. So our software goes out, finds all those, migrates all the data up to Microsoft's cloud, and then gets rid of the PSTs, all automated, so nobody has to do it manually.
Yeah. Yes. Speaking of data retention, that's for a lot of organizations, emails and just the hoarding of emails over time and over decades. I imagine that can be a pretty complex process of migrating that all over time.
That's very true.
Yeah. And that's So what we'll talk about today is all types of data. So we're really going to dive into within data management in the whole realm of data management, talking about data retention and data retention policies and how to define the right balance between data retention as well as cybersecurity concerns, as well as when you look at some of these emerging technologies where data is really important, you sort of have competing priorities potentially, or trade-offs that you need to make as it relates to those three things. And so, just in general, how would you describe, just to set the context for the audience here
Mhm.
today, especially for those that aren't that techie or maybe aren't data management experts by any means, what exactly is data retention? Like, how would you summarize it or simplify it for a layperson?
Yeah, so for the kind of the Ask AI kind of definition, it's going to tell you that it's the deliberate, systematic way in which you store, use, and delete data. So that's kind of the definition. But what does that really mean? What I like to do is kind of um, use the house analogy, right? It's so data. So like you have a house, and data is like your stuff. So some is more valuable than others. Some of it you're going to keep into a safe, right? So that's your control, is you're going to keep it in a safe. You're going to have a combination. Only certain people know it, right? For the most valuable things. Some things are less valuable. So those are going to be things that you might leave in the yard, even, right? Like or leave down on the ground that it's okay if your dogs grab and take outside.
Right.
Um,
It's a good analogy.
some things are valuable to you, but maybe not necessarily other people. So, like pictures, that type of thing. And then you have also your own systematic ways of getting rid of that data too, right? You throw stuff into the trash can. It sits in the trash can until it's full, and then you take that trash can, and then you take it outside, and you throw it in the trash can. And then the next week, the trash company comes and gets it. So everybody kind of has their own kind of valuable retention policies within kind of their personal lives, and it's kind of similar within data retention.
Right. And I'll have to admit I'm a bit of a hoarder at times. I save stuff, not just
Hmm.
data, but at home I don't like to throw stuff away. I want to make sure I get my money's worth, and I'll hang on to stuff that I shouldn't. And so you have different. I can imagine you have a lot of people within organizations that are hoarding data, hoarding the emails, hoarding the stuff that they feel like they might need. But then you might have. Do you see the dynamic where you have other extremes where maybe people are careless about the data or they don't care about the data and they're too quick to get rid of stuff that might be important to the organization?
Yeah, so you have the problem both ways. The hoarding side, especially with data, is it's even worse because that trash can that you have, it's huge, right? So like you can put data, um, you can keep stuff and data away, and you don't even see it. It's not sitting on your desk right in your face, right? You kind of just put it away,
Yeah.
and it goes wherever it goes, right? Um, but yeah, the same thing is on the careless side of it too. So not only is data retention about like how you're going to store it, how you're going to shuffle it around, it's also how you're going to protect it. So if it's um, extremely important data, you want to make sure that it's protected from accidental deletion, purposeful deletion, like say like a ransomware attack.
Mm.
So yeah, all those things kind of come into your data retention policy.
Yeah. Well, and it's always interesting to see how much data an organization has. You mentioned, emails, pictures, things of that nature.
Hmm.
And with enterprise technologies and sort of this whole movement towards computerization, digitization, and automation, all the stuff we've been going through the last few decades, you have all these organizations that have been gathering and collecting data since maybe the late 60s or the 70s, back when they put in their first, big computer systems or whatever the case may be. So it's interesting to see like how over time organizations build up this big asset that can be valuable over time, but can also create a lot of problems and challenges, cybersecurity risks, things of that nature.
Yeah.
Um,
So having kind of worked in corporate IT for a long time prior to starting the software company, um, uh, lots of times people would say, "Well, legal's going to set our data retention policy. Legal's handling that. Legal's doing this, right?" But the the truth is, there's a lot more to it, and so I think that's why I think this kind of discussion and debate kind of show how much people have kind of a say in what we should be doing with our data retention policy.
right, right.
And just a few other things to kind of throw in there about like what are, like some of, just give you an idea of all the things you need to put in to consider within your data retention policy. You have to determine, like what type of data you want to be active to where people can get to it easily or semi easily. And then what is going to be backup. When you're talking about disaster recovery, you have to determine you might hear the terms RPO and RTO.
Hmm.
So what those are is your recovery point objective, which is the RPO, is at what point do I need to be able to go back to? So like how much data am I going to keep or how fast am I going to protect that data? So if it was deleted, I could get back to it. And then RTO is how long is it going to take you to get back to it? So those
Right.
those are important because those set quite a bit of your strategy and what you're doing for disaster recovery. And then you also have to consider your industry, um, regulatory compliance, which usually ties in with the industry, um, your company's risk tolerance, and then also whether or not you're going to allow exceptions to the policy. So it's almost how stringent you're going to be with that policy as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and later we're gonna get into some of the different perspectives. What are the different perspectives and angles that you might consider your data management, data retention policies? You mentioned legal being one, but you've got other perspectives, obviously, that you need to consider within the organization. So we'll come back to that and dive into that a little bit more detail. But before we keep going, I just want to turn to the audience real quickly here and thank everyone who dropped in the chat where you're joining from today. We've got people all over the world, ranging from Wichita, Kansas to London, Kansas City, Missouri, London, UK, um, London, UK again, Holland, Michigan, Kansas City. A lot of Kansas City people. Is it because of the Chiefs just won the Super Bowl and they're out trolling the internet
They're
apparently?
still awake, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. They haven't gone to bed since the Super Bowl.
Right.
And they're here just to troll all the 49ers fans that might be on the stream. Centennial, Colorado, London, Ontario, Athens, Greece. So thanks everyone for being here today and thank you for joining. And again, if you have questions as it relates to data management, data retention, please drop it in the chat as we go here. Um, so you sort of alluded to this, but maybe we can ask it more directly and dive into it a bit more detail. But why is data retention so important, and why do you need a policy around it?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people are wondering, should I have a policy for data retention? Um, and I think kind of the reality is, if you're not defining a policy, you are defining a policy. Like the choosing to do nothing. You're choosing to do nothing. So by doing that, you're saying I'm going to keep all this data. So if that data is risky, so I'll use kind of just one quick example, like healthcare. So within healthcare, it's highly regulated. So like if it's a public company, it's regulated as well. So if there is something damaging in that data to the company, it can be discovered. So if you don't have a policy for how you're going to protect it, how you're going to delete it, then it could hurt you, like in a legal case. So getting back to by choosing to do nothing, you're setting a policy. So what you're saying is, I'm going to keep all my data. The users are going to be responsible for deleting or keeping whatever data they want. And then I am accepting all of the risks that are associated and all the costs that are associated that goes with it.
Right. Right. Yeah, and it's you're right. I mean, that's another consideration we haven't really gotten to is cost. We'll get into, IT performance or the performance of technology and applications and the ability to process the data you have, the human impact. There's a lot of different things we'll get into here. But what about for organizations that are going through some sort of digital transformation or some sort of IT change initiative, which a lot of organizations are, and certainly a lot of people listening to this podcast are? Um, how does a data retention policy factor in, or how should you consider data retention when you're going through a transformation? Because a lot of times data gets treated as more of an afterthought. Like we're focused on applications, we're focused on upgrading our infrastructure, whatever it is, or moving to the cloud, all that stuff. But then data sort of is like, oh yeah, we need to get the data over here too while we're at it. So how do you reprioritize that, or how do you navigate that, or what are some tips you have for people that are trying to figure out how to manage data retention, but also at the same time they're going through a systems upgrade or whatever the change may be?
Yeah. So if a policy exists, then might as you're going through digital transformation, it might be a good time to review that policy. So almost kind of go back and review all of the reasons you have the policy that you have. Um, so first start with your data classification. So like looking at all the different types of data you have, determining what is more valuable, what's the things you want to put in the safe, what's the things you want to leave in the yard, that kind of thing. So kind of reviewing that so that way, and I think in business everything kind of boils down to cost at some point, right? So the cost it's going to take to secure that data, the cost of storage, being able to store it somewhere, right? Being able to back it up. Um, all of those things are going to impact the project, and you have to plan those out accordingly. So if you're doing a big digital transformation, that's also one of the times that where you've got a lot of duplication of data. So as you're migrating systems, you're copying some data over. So you're like maybe you're switching an ERP system. You got to get all your data from the old one, either migrated into the new one, or you're going to run two systems at the same time. Well, now you've just doubled your things to manage, right? Because you've got all the systems related to your old system, you've got all the systems related to your new system, you've got double the storage, you've got different access maybe to old systems. So I would say during a digital transformation, it's almost good just to kind of start from the beginning and kind of just review the policy, see if everything still makes sense, and make changes before you go through that large initiative.
Yeah. Yeah, and you wanna make sure you're not waiting until, you're doing the testing cycles. A lot of times organizations wait till, like, the last round of integration testing or user acceptance testing, and then they load a bunch of data to start to test and work with the data then. But, if you wait till then, it's usually too late, or you're gonna make some bad decisions or cut some corners as it relates to data. So, not just for data retention, but just data management in general, data migration, it's always important to start that work stream a lot earlier than you probably think.
Hmm.
Um, what about, is it realistic for organizations just to have policies just to keep all their data? I mean, is that a realistic thing, or why wouldn't you do that?
That is a realistic thing. So the kind of a good example of that is I worked for a mortgage company around the 2008 kind of mortgage crisis, right? And the for a mortgage, it could be 30 years, right?
Right.
You need to keep the data that you have for 30 years. And the company I worked for would originate the loans. So what they would do is they'd collect all the data from their customers, right? And then they would do their determination on whether or not they could get the loan. Um, and the kind of the 2008 mortgage crisis was around people who wrote some bad loans. It's people that couldn't pay for their loan. They ran into trouble. They walked away from the loan. And within mortgage, what they do is they sell them together. So they do like groups of loans, and they call them mortgage-backed securities.
Hmm.
So they put a bunch of loans together, they sell them to investors. Well, the investors in 2008 were like, hey, wait a minute, all these people that originated these loans, they're the ones who screwed up. They're the ones liable. So we're going to basically sue them to get our money back.
Hmm.
So the mortgage company I worked for kept all their data. So
Interesting.
they had all that data. So when they came back and said, hey, you need to buy back this loan because you guys made a mistake, the company was able to go back and say, nope, here's what we did, here's what we did everything right, you have to stick with that. And so, um, keeping all your data is very helpful for some companies. Depends on the industry and
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
whether
And
they're
I'd be
doing the
curious.
right things in mortgage.
Right. Right. Yeah. Mortgage is a great example of kind of a long term data
Hmm.
need that's highly regulated as well. And I'm going to come back to the regulation point here in just a second with an audience question. But
Yeah.
um, one now I lost my train of thought. What was I going to ask you? As you're going through, as you're going through this, I'd love to hear from the audience what, if your organization has a data retention policy, or if you don't know, maybe just let us know you don't know if you have one or not. I'm curious to know if, does your organization have a data retention policy? Are you aware of it? Love to hear the audience's feedback here.
Yeah.
And speaking of audience feedback, speaking of regulation, here's a question from YouTube, and that is there a legal regulation in the USA and EU for data retention? Like for how many years you have to keep data? Is that typically regulated? Does it vary by industry? How would you answer that, Chad?
Yeah, I would say it varies by industry. It also there's quite a bit of different factors. So like healthcare is Everything has to comply with the HIPAA, which is the Health Information and Protection and Portability Act. Um, so HIPAA for healthcare. One of the other things to watch out for is within the U.S. is taxes, right? So the Internal Revenue Service, most companies will keep like 7 years of data, just so they're able to, if because that's what you could be audited back to for IRS. So you'll see a lot of companies start at 7 years just for the IRS reason.
Right. Here in the US, the IRS is our tax authority in every country. And here's a comment from oops. Here's a comment from LinkedIn. I don't see who made the comment, but it varies by type of data and country. So that's a great, a valid, definitely a valid point. Um, Here's a question I want to get to, Chad, because I think it's a great one. This is from YouTube as well. Eric, you stated most implementation data is an afterthought and priority. What do you suggest in new implementations how to address this issue while data is updated all the time? So it's a great point because data is a moving target. You're always new transactional data, even new master data, new emails, spreadsheets that are being updated, all that stuff. How do you navigate that, or what are your thoughts around that, Chad?
Yeah. So the if you look at it from the user perspective, they want to keep everything. Like
Right.
so a good example is I've talked to people who are like they're trying to remember. I do this too. You know, like I'm probably one of the worst offenders at keeping all my email data,
Hmm.
because I'm
Me
always
too.
like, yeah, I'm like, so if you're working on something and you know, like kind of like an old partner comes back into the mix or something like that, and you're like, oh, that partner, what did we work on together? What was the last thing we did? What was their phone number? All of those things, you're able to go back, search for your email, and say, oh, here's the last interaction I had with them. Here is their phone number. Here's the last thing we worked on. Um, so kind of getting back to the importance is a lot of people want to keep their data. So when you're talking about a project team who's doing an ERP implementation, that's not necessarily a battle that you want to fight, right? Like, so you're going to have strict project timelines, right? You've got to get this implementation done within whatever time that you have for your project. And if you and for people who have tried to implement a change to a data retention policy, um, they've got a lot of scars and bruises.
Hmm. Yeah.
um, a good example is at that mortgage company. Actually, we tried to implement a policy that said anything that was in the deleted items of email could actually be deleted and go away. And
Hmm.
like based on 30 days, because there's Microsoft Exchange makes it real easy with policies where you can set a policy and then that policy is going to do exactly what you told it to do. And we were trying to just set it to say anything older than 30 days and the deleted items, we're going to actually get rid of that. It's not just going to sit in that folder anymore. But we got beat up pretty bad from that. So if
Hmm.
you're trying to do a digital transformation and we're looking at timelines, like is that once you try to fight for changes in the policy, you might get beat up and it might slow down your project. So I think a lot of people end up skipping it, but it's
Hmm.
it can save the company on risk and money if you do that ahead of time.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's well said, and that's a great point. I mean, a lot of times companies just take the path of least resistance and say, "Yeah, we don't want to get beat up on that 30-day deletion policy example that you just gave, so we're just going to keep it the
Mhm.
way it is, even if it's not ideal or not the right answer longer term."
Right.
Um, so we talked a lot about legal considerations. We talked a little bit about maybe from the end user or employee perspective, but maybe help us understand what are the different perspectives we have to think about across the board as it relates to data retention policies.
Yeah. So for the so I'll start kind of with like the operations of a lot of organizations,
Yeah.
and it varies a little bit by industry. So using some things are valuable, right? For businesses, data is extremely valuable. And for so I could use the mortgage example for a financial company. For a marketing company, that data is extremely important because they're able to keep track of their customers. So, like, say, their preferences, their contact information. Um, Healthcare. highly regulated. It's important for them to make sure they've got the right policies to clean that up. But within, I think, every organization, each department kind of has different requirements as well.
Mm,
So, human resources, right? They're the ones who have to deal with if there is like an employee and employee conflict. They get called
mm,
in legal battles, right? So
right.
the data that is available could either help them or harm them. So they've got a lot of information that they want to add to kind of the data retention policy. You've got the end users. This is a good, like we talked about. They want to keep everything because it can help them, right?
Right.
They don't know that some of them might actually hurt the company. You've got the like within the IT organization, you have the CISO, so the Chief Information Security Officer, who they have like so. Um, Using the house analogy, if you've got a ton of data, you're going to have to make your house bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. Well, that's a lot more to manage. So, for people who are doing the securing of the data, the more data you have, the more things you have to do to make sure you're securing it properly and make sure you have the right access. Um,
Mm,
and then um, customers, like they actually have a say in your data retention policy as well, and you're starting to see that more and more, which translates to regulatory. Because uh, like example, I think a lot of people have seen is a company takes your credit card information, right, in order to for you to purchase something from them, and then if they get breached and that data gets out into the open, then now they've affected their customers, which affects their um, how the customer sees them and whether or not they want to buy from them. And if you're keeping all the data, then you may have customers that come in and out. Target's a good example, who got breached, right, with credit card
yeah.
data.
Yeah.
So they have customers coming in and out all the time. So if you're cleaning up some of that data, get rid of it, then your impact's much less. So say they were cleaning up their data and only half of the credit cards got lost, then then you're only really impacting half of the customers. Um, I was just looking on my list here to see if there was any other ones. Project teams, we talked about that a little bit,
Yeah.
because what your data retention policies do can affect projects. And then the one that's probably most near and dear to my heart, being from IT, is your data retention policy determines um, how IT architects their systems.
Mm,
So for somebody who keeps all their data, if that's kind of the best strategy for the company, that's fine. But you have to realize that IT now has to then buy the storage to be able to hang on to that, or you're paying per the gig if you're using a cloud service. And then you also have to put in the systems to protect that data to be able to recover it. The more data you have, the longer it takes to recover. So that policy has, kind of that. There's a lot of cascading implications just from what you're determining what you want to do with the policy.
yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And this is from uh, an attendee on YouTube. He says, or he or she says, Melbourne, Australia here. Yes, security, OHS, finance, FMIT, just a few groups that don't even know or agree on how they classify data, let alone retain it. So that's from Do Ya Reckon on is the handle on YouTube. So thanks for the comment. So I've got one more question, Chad, before we sort of shift
Mhm.
gears, bring on our third guest here to help us moderate the next part of the discussion. But um, we've talked a bit about this in passing. We sort of danced around this whole idea of data privacy and data security. And I talked about at the beginning of the discussion how those are conflicting priorities. Like you just sort of pointed out a few of the conflicting priorities. As a user, I want to keep everything, right. That's easiest for me. There's no
Mhm.
skin off my back. That's IT's problem to figure out how to figure out storage and the cost of it and all that stuff you just mentioned. But of course, IT does care because they're the ones that have to deal with the budget and the cost and the headache of preserving all that. So there's a lot of conflicts here and conflicting priorities within an organization. But when you look at data privacy, data security, those are two other potential conflicting priorities too. How would you unpack that?
Yeah, so trying to boil it down to the business language of dollars and cents, right?
Hmm.
The You can debate whether or not these are accurate, but there's like the Ponymon Institute comes up with a cost per record. So they're using that based on the averages of what companies had to pay when they were breached. So they're saying, well, your for your industry, which is very important, your cost per record can vary. And so, like, if you were to get breached and say one record got out, that's basically what they're saying. So, if
Yeah.
one record, so that record could be um, Eric's email to us that had his social security number, his address, and his phone number. So that one record would cost the company this amount of dollars. So for healthcare, that's $402.
Hmm.
For financial, that's $264. So the healthcare information is costs more if you were to get breached. So a security person wants to um, have less of that data,
Right.
as opposed to one that has the lower cost per record. But so your data retention policy is kind of drives the how you're going to secure that data. So if I've got I'm keeping information for marketing for reasons. So like maybe like an Amazon as an example, right? Um, I come in, I put in my address, my credit card information. If they were to get rid of that information right away, then the security team wouldn't care about having to protect that data from other people getting into it because
Yeah.
it's gone, right?
They'd probably love
Um,
it. They'd be like, "That's a great idea. Just get
that's a
rid of
great
them."
idea. If you don't have any data, then we don't have to worry about it getting breached, right?
Right.
Get bad for the business, but good for the security group because they don't have as much to do to secure it. So I think they have the perspective of wanting to have less data in there, or at least the data that's damaging, right? So some of the things you can do is you can look for like within the United States, a lot of people have the social security number stored within
Mm.
databases. So something as simple as our data retention policy is maybe we're going to keep all of this data about our customers, but what we're going to do is we're just going to go through and all the social security number data, we're just going to blank that out because we
Right.
don't need that anymore. We did that to get their credit report, but now we don't need it. So let's just get rid of that. So then we're not at risk of that data getting out.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a great example. And you look at the Target breach or, any of these big global corporations that have had breaches where consumer data has been stolen, like credit card information, social security numbers, things of that nature. It'd be easy to look at that use case and say, well, they should have just not kept that data. But of course, if you're a retailer and you're concerned about customer experience and, making it easy to purchase and you want to drive revenue, things of that nature, obviously it doesn't make sense to get rid of that data from a revenue generation perspective. So you really have to kind of balance those. And do you see organizations struggle to balance these conflicting priorities? I mean, ultimately, who decides? I mean, how do you
Yeah.
see organizations resolve this?
And that's one of the things I think that I've seen is that it's not everybody coming in collaboratively and going
All
through and
agree.
saying, "Hey, here's what I think we should do. Here's what I think we should do. Here's what I think we should do." What they're doing is they're leaving it up to either one group or one person to say, "Here's what our policy is. Now you have to implement it." Like they don't have any. They're not thinking about like, well, that person needs to add 2 headcount. They need to add $1 million to their IT budget. They're not thinking about those types of things. Um, they're just most of the time they're saying legal's deciding that.
Right.
Which when you are regulated, I think that is the very first thing you have to look at because that is extremely important. But it's not. That policy doesn't need to apply to all the data, right? It's only applies to the data that's tied to that regulation. Um,
Right.
so I think having more collaboration within the designing of a data retention policy would be a good thing for organizations.
Yeah. Yeah. Makes total sense. And I'm still curious if anyone has comments on whether your organization has a data retention policy. And if so, are you familiar with it? I'm curious to hear your feedback in the chat. So please drop that in. While you're doing that, though, we are going to shift gears a bit. Are you ready to do more of a? We'll sort of dive into some specific examples. Chad, does that work for you to make
Sounds
that
great.
transition now? So to help us moderate this discussion, I'm going to bring on Darian Fikuski, who's a first time attendee or first time guest on our podcast. So, hello, Darian. Good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Thanks for being here. It's your first time on the podcast. Are you nervous?
No, confident.
Okay, we'll try our best to make you nervous as we're going through this. No, but the reason we want to have Darian on the show is we thought it might be kind of fun, Chad, to take what we've talked about so far conceptually and we've put together some specific use cases and examples of things to consider and what some of these trade-offs are. And you and I are going to sort of take some different counterpoints and different perspectives from different stakeholders within an organization to show how it's not an easy answer. And you and I, if we have different perspectives or coming at it from different departments or whatever, you and I are going to have different priorities and different opinions on what a data retention policy is. So we thought it would be fun to dive into that. So Darian, with that being said, why don't you dive in and sort of tell us what the scenarios and perspectives are, and then Chad and I will give our knee-jerk reactions to that.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, so audience, if you guys want to comment during the discussion and say who you maybe agree with or what perspective you agree with more, that'd be awesome to hear what you guys are thinking. First of all, Eric, your perspective will be on the legal side, and Chad, your perspective will be coming from the IT side. The industry for this one is healthcare, and then IT is going to be implementing this policy. And the policy is from 0 to 7 years, you're keeping it. 7 to 10 years, you back it up. And if it's over 10 years, you're going to delete it. So, Eric, what are your thoughts on the legal side?
This is healthcare. I'm going to say I don't like it. Because I don't think we're keeping enough of that data, because I'm concerned if there's any sort of litigation over time or long-term outcome effect of the healthcare we've provided, we wouldn't have the data to necessarily defend us if we needed it or to back us from a legal perspective. So I'd say that policy does not work for us from a legal perspective.
Okay, and Chad, what are your thoughts?
So it's close, but I actually think we're keeping too much of that data. So I think we're in agreement that it's maybe not the right policy, but your perspective is that you want to keep more of the data because you're legal, right? Me being IT, I know what happens the last time I came to the CIO and asked for more budget for more storage, and they said, "Well, can't we clean anything up?" It's like, well, we can't because the policy says that we got to keep at least 7 years of this stuff. So I think we're a little bit on the we're both agreeing that we don't like 7 years, but it's I like it because I think it's too I don't like it because I think it's too long. Eric doesn't like it because he thinks it's too short.
Yeah, and I guess if I thought that was long enough, and I guess it's objective too, right? Is 7 years, is that a reasonable cutoff? Is that too long, too short? You could easily make an argument that that's good from that perspective, but yeah, I think it's already we're seeing that it's a definitely a gray area for sure.
And one of the other things too is like as IT having it, we're the ones that are responsible for implementing, which happens with a lot of companies. Having something that says we need to now delete anything older than 10 years means that I've got to go through, put all the systems in place to go out and actually delete that data to go in line with the policy. And I also have to deal with the end customer, which would be the end users, right? Response when I actually start deleting that data.
Right. Quick comment from LinkedIn.
Yeah.
Delete should not be an option for healthcare. So that's a interesting point. I don't know if that's any regulatory. There's probably regulatory bodies throughout the world that might agree with you on that and might in fact have some laws that say you can't delete. I'm not familiar with them if they are, but that could be the case. So great point.
Yeah, I would be curious if that delete shouldn't be an option if that's somebody who actually works in the industry, and that's kind of their perspective from being at that company, or if it's the customer perspective.
Right. Just another beef, not to hijack your conversation here, Darian, but this is from Eric. Eric on YouTube says, "I work for a government contractor. Our data retention policies are defined by our government customers and clearly stated in our contracts." So in some ways, his situation might be a little bit easier because there's not that gray area. I mean, whether it's good or bad probably doesn't matter a whole lot if you government contract or if your contract with your customers tell you what you can and can't do from a data perspective.
That's quite a bit to manage though too, right? Like,
yeah,
because the more differences you have in your policy, so the more complex it is. So like that's kind of like what we're talking about is like a policy that we're saying this is kind of the general idea, right? When you get into the details of it, like different types of data, so how you classify it, this type of data might be different than that type of data. Now when you're talking about dealing with different customers who have different policies. So now you've got to be able to apply that policy specific to that customer, which is going to add a lot more complexity, which is probably adds a lot more cost as well.
Yeah, it's a great point. That's why you don't want me in charge of your data policies, because I didn't think of that perspective. So that's a good point.
and you know, being in the United States and have government who has increasing costs, maybe they should come together on a policy that's one policy for the government agencies, so that way you don't have to have different policies for each government customer.
Yeah, makes total sense.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so for the next perspective, we're just going to shift perspectives, but keep the same plan. So healthcare is still the industry, IT is still implementing, and then it's the same data retention program still. So the 0 to 7 years, you're keeping it, 7 to 10, you're backing it up, and then greater than 10, you're deleting it. The perspectives this time, Eric, you're the CISO, and Chad, you're going to be the CEO. Eric, what are your thoughts?
Well, if I'm the CISO, and I'm in this highly regulated industry called healthcare, and for example, in the U.S., we've got these HIPAA rules that Chad mentioned before, where you know, they're pretty stringent on not revealing any sort of customer or patient information. This policy makes me nervous, and I don't like it because we're keeping so much of it that it's just we're more exposed by keeping data for that long. So, from my perspective as CISO, Chief Information Security Officer, by the way, in case you weren't familiar with that acronym, I would say it's a bad policy, or one that I don't like.
Yeah. Chad, how about you? What do you think about for the CEO?
From the CEO's perspective, healthcare companies can make a lot of money off that data. So they can anonymize it, they can sell it off for market research, they can work with drug companies to help identify candidates for studies. So I can make a lot of money off of having all this data out there. So from the CEO's perspective, I kind of like it.
Yeah, interesting. Like that. So for the next perspective, an audience, keep commenting of who you agree with and what your thoughts are as well. For the next perspective, Eric, you're going to be operations, and Chad, you're going to be HR. Chad, what are your thoughts on the HR side of this policy?
Yeah, so from the HR side, I want as little data as possible working in healthcare, because within healthcare you have a ton of people. So I'm trying to limit down the amount of things that I have to take care of, and if I've got a lot of people and then I've got a lot of interactions between employee and employee, I want to limit the amount of data that could come back and hurt the company in a lawsuit.
Yeah, totally makes sense. And Eric, what are your thoughts on the operations side?
Well, I like it from an operations perspective because we are keeping a fair amount of data over a good amount of time, and I can make better decisions. I have everything I need. There's no questions that I need to go back and recreate through tribal knowledge. So I like it from an operations perspective.
Yeah, makes sense. For the last perspective of this program, so it's still the healthcare and the IT implementation with the same data retention program. Chad, you're going to take from the sales marketing perspective, and Eric, you're going to do the project team perspective. Chad, what are your thoughts on the marketing side for this program?
Yeah, so from the sales and marketing side, I'm a diabetic, so I'll use that kind of as the example. So from sales and marketing, we've got all this data. We're in a healthcare company. Say a new drug comes out, right? That will help diabetics keep their blood sugar in range. I can use all the data of everybody who has come into our clinic. I know if I've got their lab results, I know what their A1C is, which measures how good you're doing on your blood sugar. And we could say anybody who's got an A1C of say 8 or above, we're going to go contact them and say, hey, there's this new drug that would help you keep your blood sugar in control, and then that way we can make some more money as opposed to them going to somebody else to get that same drug.
Really. And Eric, what are your thoughts on the project team side?
Yeah, I don't like it from the project team side because it's a lot of data to deal with. So I've got to figure out how to, if we're going through a digital transformation and that's the kind of project team we're talking about, that's just a lot of data for me now to figure out how I'm going to map it all to the new system or systems, how I'm going to clean it up, how I'm going to migrate it, test it, clean it up, all that stuff. So from that perspective, that's just too much for a project team to deal with effectively, and it's probably going to slow down our project.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's super cool to see the different perspectives and how everybody can have a different perspective depending on your position. So we're gonna, for the audience, we're gonna move on to a different data retention program now. So and we'll do the same thing. Eric and Chad will each get 4 different perspectives, and we will debate each one. If you want to comment and share your thoughts on each perspective, we'd love to hear what you guys are thinking. For the next data retention program, it's going to be 0 to 2 years. You're going to keep the data. From 2 to 3 years, you're going to back it up. And anything over 3 years old, you're going to delete it. It is in the manufacturing industry, and the end users are implementing the policy. So with that said, Eric, your perspective to start is going to be on the sales marketing side. And Chad, yours is going to be the CISO position. So Chad, what are your thoughts from that standpoint?
Well, I like the fact that we're going to have a lot less data. That's a good thing, because the manufacturing has a lower cost per record if it's breached, but it's still scope, right? Like things I have to take care of. I have to go through and figure out who's going to have the right access to the data. If there's less of it, that makes my job a little bit easier. Um, the one thing I don't like about the policy, though, is that the end users are the ones implementing it. So if the end users are doing it, I've seen that story play out before. It's not going to happen.
Right.
Right. Makes sense. And Eric, what are your thoughts about it from the marketing side?
Yeah, I definitely don't like it from the marketing side. I feel like I've disliked every policy so far. But I don't like it from the sales and marketing side because I'm trying to sell and market to our customers to create long-term repeat business. We're constantly improving or constantly introducing new products to the marketplace, and we want to go back and market to people that maybe haven't bought from us from a while. So from that perspective, 2 years just isn't enough to keep that data. So I would love to see it be a lot greater than that, a lot more retention than what we're seeing there.
Yeah, makes sense. So we're going to keep the same program and we're going to switch perspectives here. Chad, you're going to go to HR, and Eric, you're going to do ops. What are you thinking from an operations standpoint for this program, Eric?
Still don't like it. You're still not convincing me that I should like it because now it's, I don't have all that history of all my production history and certainly all the master data of products that or sub-assemblies or raw materials maybe we used in the past but we haven't used recently. I'm going to need that stuff within maybe greater than 2 years out. So if that stuff goes away, that data goes away, and I don't have access to it, that's going to make things a lot more complicated operationally, and I'm going to be recreating the wheel along the way to try to recreate that data.
Yeah, makes sense. And Chad, what are your thoughts on the HR perspective?
Mostly like the policy because of the limited liability. Um, the manufacturing, especially nowadays, it's a lot more. You're getting a lot more automation, so I don't have as many employees. But one of the things that I don't like about it is that it's going to follow the end users. So that means from an HR perspective that now we've got to communicate that out. We got to make sure people are actually following the policy, and then like take action where we have problems.
Yeah, totally. For the next perspective, same program again, same implementers, so end users are still implementing it. Eric, you're going to take the CEO perspective, and Chad, you're going to be the project team perspective. Chad, what do you think from the project team perspective?
Firstly, I think it's not good that the way we randomized the departments, Eric, because you're right, you kind of fell on the kind of the same position, I think.
I'm the negative. I'm the negative Nelly. I'm the buzzkill.
Right. Like our randomizer didn't work so good, did it? For
No,
the
it
for the
didn't.
departments, we got to build a new randomizer.
Right.
So from the project team perspective, um, I'm trying to get the project done quick. I want to get I want to have as little to deal with as possible. Um, so I like the idea of not as much data. It could impact me a little bit as I'm doing the migration. So say I've got one system, the old system that I'm working off of, and it's got we got users in there saying I need to follow this policy. I'm going in and deleting data. Well, I'm in the middle of a migration here, so I'm migrating the data. If they're deleting it as I'm trying to migrate, that can run into some problems when they go to the new system. Say, oh, my data's not there. You don't know who deleted it. But mostly, I like it because it's less scope for me.
Right. And Eric, from the CEO perspective, what are you thinking?
Yeah, still don't like it because I'm trying to grow the company. I'm trying to grow revenue. I want our sales guys and gals to be able to have access to past customer data, transactional history, all that stuff. The IT and cybersecurity guys, they'll figure out the downside of it. I'm not too worried about it. I mean, it can't be that difficult, right? I'm a CIO. I'm gonna sit in my ivory tower and assume that IT can solve it all for us. So for that reason, I'm gonna say it's a bad thing.
Yeah, makes sense. And for the last perspective of the show, Eric, we're going to give you both the owner. And if you could share different sides of being the owner, whether it's good or bad, that would be great from that perspective. So maybe Chad, you go first for the owner perspective.
Yeah. So from the owner perspective, I'm going to say it's a good thing. So I'm assuming my manufacturing company has slimmer margins on what I'm producing. So the less is more. Less data I have to I don't less it's less storage that I have to pay for. It's less security. So I like it from that perspective of keeping my costs down.
Yeah. And Eric, what are your thoughts as an owner with this program?
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to grow the company, and we're constantly introducing new products, like similar to my CEO perspective before, I suppose. But I'd say, as an owner, it's not a good thing. I want to protect that asset as the owner. There's a lot of value in that data, so I'd want to see us keep more of that data over time.
Yeah, truly. Well, that wraps up all the different perspectives that we have planned for today. So I'm going to hand it back over to Eric for the closing.
All right, sounds good. Well, actually, this is my closer right here. This is from YouTube. Eric, you are the bomb. I'm just gonna leave it right there. That's from Atolia from on YouTube. So thank you for that. That came in right as you were handing it over to me, so I had to share that. No, I guess just to wrap it up, and I'll leave you up here too, Darian, just for this last question. But from now that we've covered all these different perspectives, and you've helped us unpack this, Chad. This whole concept of trade-offs and the competing priorities within an organization, and certainly when you consider regulatory stuff as well, there's some external factors that oftentimes create competing priorities. What are some of the next steps? Like, how do I make sense of this? I'm on a project team or an executive within an organization. What do I do? How do I get started? What are some recommendations you have?
Yeah, so I think the one of the first things to keep in mind is that if you increase complexity, that means you're going to increase your labor and your costs, right? So keep it simple as much as possible. That's kind of the first thing to consider. Then secondly, I'd say classify your data. Go through your data. Either have like an external consulting company maybe come in and go through and help you determine all the different types of data you have. And like you can debate whether or not how accurate the data is for the cost per record, but maybe use that to kind of help you determine how valuable the data is. So almost like assigning a value to that data when you're doing the classification. 100% look at your industry regulations, because you don't want to be violating any of those, because that could come back to bite you in multiple ways. And then solicit feedback from multiple departments. And kind of tied with that is, like, even if you're not able to solicit feedback and get everybody's opinion on what you should have in it, at least clearly communicate what your policy is and why. So that way you're not creating problems within departments. Like I working in IT. If your policy is to keep all the data, then it makes it a lot easier for me to come in when I'm saying we need more budget for storage, because everybody's like, okay, well, yes, we know that's our policy. We're going to keep that data for that long. So clearly communicating it helps make things easier within the organization. And then kind of the last thing to add to that is there is a which consultants can help with, which is the business impact analysis. So you can go through and look at, like at from now you got your data classified. If I were to lose this data, what would happen? If like from I didn't have it available to me from an operations perspective, or if I were to lose it in a breach, what would happen? Just so you get an idea of the scenarios before they actually do, and then that way you can make better decisions about your data.
Right. Do you recommend there being a sort of a committee or a board or something that comes together with different stakeholders, different perspectives to make these decisions, or like from a decision making or governance
Yeah.
perspective to do what you just said? How do you recommend doing that?
Yeah, I think it's maybe not necessarily a board unless one already exists. So a lot of companies have a change management board, right? Like you talked quite a bit about change management. That might be the best place to have that discussion. But even if not, just when you're either first implementing your policy, getting everybody together, just kind of for a day or two, right, to go through everything and kind of define your policy, and then maybe review that every some sort of cycle, whatever's right for your company, whether that's a year, whether that's every 3 years, just to go back and say, has anything changed from a regulation perspective, which you'll see policies get changed quite a bit from regulations. Like legal teams will say, well, this regulation changed. Now we got to update the policy. Well, that should be a trigger to get everybody together again, as opposed to just change the policy.
Yeah. That's good stuff. Good advice. Well, thanks for being here, Chad. Really appreciate it. And
Sure.
how do people learn more about LAE Software? How do they get in touch with you? What's the best way?
Yeah, so lesoftware.com is our website. And then also you can find me on LinkedIn. And then also my email address is just chad@lesoftware.com.
Great. Perfect. Awesome. Well, we'll all email you and then figure out what you do with that data as we see how long you keep it. But
Right.
well, thanks for being here. Really appreciate it, and glad to have you. And thanks to the audience for the great questions here and for being part of this. We're gonna edit this episode. We'll add more content to it, and then we'll make it part of our next episode of Transformation Ground Control. So we'll add to this interview and polish it up, and you'll see that come out a week from Wednesday, or a week from tomorrow, I should say. You can find past episodes as well as upcoming episodes at transformationgroundcontrol.com. So be sure to check that out. It's a weekly podcast that covers all things related to digital transformation. It's a tech agnostic podcast as well. So be sure to check it out. It also streams to YouTube, LinkedIn, and Twitter as well, and Facebook. So thanks everyone for being here. Appreciate it. Hope you have a great week, and we'll see you next week. Same time, same place. We're always doing these live discussions as part of our podcast production. So thanks for being here, and hope to see you next time. Have a great week in the meantime. Take care.